This is Sid Haas with LKCS. I'm the Vice President of Business Development, and I want to welcome you to today's webinar focusing on web accessibility and the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. For those of you not familiar with our company, we focus on working with financial institutions. We currently work with banks and credit unions in 48 states and have been working with financial institutions since the early 1960s. You can see on this one slide just kind of a range of our services, but our focus is really on utilizing data across all channels to improve our clients' marketing efforts. And that's everything from traditional, printing and direct mail services to statements and e-statements, and obviously into websites and all sorts of electronic marketing services. But today we'll be focusing obviously on web accessibility. And to discuss web accessibility, just to define it, obviously web accessibility is all about ensuring that people with disabilities can use the web and obviously your websites in particular. And when we think about that, what that means is all users must be able to perceive, understand, navigate, interact with, and contribute to the web. And when the attorneys get together and discuss the Americans with Disabilities Act, they've determined that websites must provide equal access and equal opportunity to people with disabilities. And that all makes perfect sense and sounds easy until we realize how people with disabilities use the web. And there's all sorts of different disabilities that we have to make websites be aware of. So people that can't use a traditional keyboard or a traditional mouse, we have to make sure that we can access and navigate a website with a keyboard. And for those of us that use a mouse every day, that's not that easy. When we talk about video, for example, which is so popular on the web today, we need to make sure that we have captions for people that might not be able to hear or understand the audio. For people that may not be blind but may have some visual difficulties, we need to make sure that there's large links and buttons and controls and give them that ability to change text size and different things like that. And what about people that need to access through voice recognition, our websites? So there's different concerns when it comes to web development that we have to be aware of. And accessibility isn't about all, people that with severe disabilities. We also have to realize that not all users are equally tech savvy or financial literate. So a lot of these accessibility requirements that we're going to be talking about today actually do really improve the overall usability of our websites as well. So some of the requirements are that we have to provide clear notifications and feedback. So when we have forms on our website, which a lot of us do, and we all want to have that interactivity and give, our account holders that ability to take action on our website, we need to make sure that we have clear error messages. I don't know if this one's very clear to read, but, it's error and a whole bunch of strings of letters and numbers, invalid data. We need to provide clearly, hey, you need to put in an email address, in this proper form, or this field is required, please fill it in. We need to have colors with good contrast. Obviously, we need to have a clear layout and design, which should be the goal of any website. And then we need to avoid jargon and acronyms. And, the financial world is full of those, and any industry is. But, we need to make sure that we're, writing the content of our websites with all of that in mind. So a lot of these accessibility requirements are really better for everybody, not just the truly disabled. But the reason that a lot of us, a lot of you are on the call and on the webinar today is that, the threat of lawsuits in today's environment. Financial institutions are the most recent targets, right? We know that these threats begin with a demand letter, claiming to have identified access barriers on a website. And the goal of these letters, and this particular law firm in general, is to seek a settlement agreement, which includes an award, obviously, of attorney's fees and costs to the so-called plaintiff, and a web accessibility compliance plan. So they still want you to fix your website. They found something wrong with your website. They want you to fix the website. They want you to pay the plaintiff, for finding these issues. They obviously want you to award, attorney's fees for them bringing this to your attention. So the goal is to obviously kind of make sure your websites are in compliance with the web accessibility requirements, hopefully before you receive one of these threat letters. So to reduce your litigation risk, we've talked to lots of attorneys and lots of legal experts, which I'm not in this area, but you need to be proactive, and we'll discuss this a little bit. But you need to take action to address web accessibility issues now, and preferably not to wait until you receive a demand letter, because at that point it's really too late. We've worked with several clients that once they receive that demand letter, they take the steps to, modify their websites, but they're still paying, settlements, unfortunately, even after they've made their sites fully compliant, because obviously, this web firm or this law firm doesn't always have the best intentions at heart. Let's just leave it at that. You should implement an ADA website accessibility policy, and you should do that even before your website is fully ADA compliant or meets the ADA requirements. And what that does, it affirms your commitment to compliance. It lets site visitors know of your efforts, even if you're still evaluating what these efforts are. So even if you haven't started fixing the website, putting a policy out there lets them know, that these are your plans, or this is what you're looking at, or you're at least aware, of the website accessibility. It provides for ongoing monitoring and auditing. And a very important piece of this is it gives visitors to your website a way to report accessibility issues. So you need a public policy posted on your website, and I'd be happy to send you a sample of one of those. So if you don't have one or haven't seen what I'm talking about, just shoot me an email and I'd be happy to send you sample language that you can have your compliance people review and edit at your free will. But that's something I'd be happy to send out, and I'll have my contact information if you don't have it up at the end of the presentation today. So I've used the word compliance and comply, and it's really important to understand that the Americans with Disability Act does not directly address website accessibility, and it does not include any technical standard for determining compliance. So there really is no such thing as ADA compliance, even though it's all over, the the web in general. Every publication we seem to pick up mentions ADA compliance, but there really is no such thing yet as ADA compliance when it comes to websites. The Department of Justice is responsible for enforcing the Americans with Disabilities Act, and they have shown that the ADA's requirements are not limited to physical places, so they would also apply to websites. And this has held up in some courts, in some federal courts, but not, there have not been suits brought in all federal courts in all districts. So we don't know if all of the courts would agree. And the Department of Justice has not yet issued a technical standard for web accessibility, and they're not expected to do that before next year, before 2018. But there are practical standards for web accessibility, and there are one in particular that we'll be talking about in great detail that do exist, and those are the ones that we're expecting the Department of Justice to adopt. So we're expecting that sometime next year, that the Department of Justice will say that websites, to meet the requirements of the Americans with Disabilities Act will need to meet these accessibility standards. They have not done that yet. But there are these web content accessibility guidelines called WCAG guidelines that have risen to the top that seem to be the leading contender for what the Department of Justice will adopt. There's no guarantee that this is what they're going to adopt, but all the pundits and all the experts in accessibility seem to indicate that this is likely going to be the standard that they adopt. The WCAG guidelines, web content accessibility guidelines, are currently at level 2. And there are 3 levels of guidelines. There's a level A, a level AA, and a level AAA. Level A is a very basic set of accessibility guidelines. Level AA adds, some additional guidelines to that. And level AAA adds some significant guidelines. And that level AAA is really meant for sites that are exclusively meant to serve the disabled community. So our recommendation, and most people's recommendations, is that these level AA standards, the WCAG level AA standards, should be your objective. So when you discuss making your website accessible, you should be looking towards meeting the requirements of the WCAG level AA guidelines. And there's 4 areas of those guidelines. The first area is that your website needs to be perceivable, the content of your website. So I'll give you some examples of what that means. One of the most important requirements is that you need to provide text alternatives for non-text content. So think images, logos, photographs, non-text content. So when we talk about images, we're talking about adding what's known as alt tags or descriptions. So somebody who can't see the image can at least read or have read to them via these screen reading technologies, a description of what that image is. We need to provide captions and other alternatives for multimedia. Again, video is extremely popular these days, but poses a lot of challenges for anybody with disabilities. So we need to have video transcripts, and third-party services such as YouTube and Vimeo can actually add transcripts automatically for you. They may not be perfect, but that's a free option. And there are third-party services that for a fee can add captions to your videos as well. We need to create content that can be presented in different ways, including by assistive technologies without losing meaning. Basically, there's a lot of different technologies that will read the contents of a website to somebody that can't see or can't see well. So there's a lot of different screen readers, they're called. And we need to make sure that websites are coded properly with HTML tags to identify the reading sequence and the hierarchy of content. If you think about it, when we're looking at a website, obviously we'll start at the top and look down, but, our eye, we know where navigation menus are, and, we know by looking at the size of content and color of content and what's bold and things like that as to what's a heading and what's body text and all of those things. Well, to a computer reading a website, that's all done with what's known as HTML tags. So web developers need to code sites properly so websites can be read properly. We need to make it easier for users to see and hear content. So again, we need to make sure that we're using appropriate colors and contrast ratios. We still see a lot of websites that, maybe there's some links that we don't want to call too much attention to. I can think of some privacy policy links and some, things like that. We need to have them on our website. We don't want to call lots of attention to them, so we put them, in a color that may not be completely obvious, but that doesn't meet accessibility guidelines. So we need to be careful of the colors and the contrast ratios that we're using. We need to make sure that text links make sense when they're read out of context. So the second area of these WCAG guidelines is that your website must be operable to people with disabilities. So again, we need to make sure that all functionality is available from a keyboard. Accessing a website, and especially navigation menus from a keyboard, is not that easy, at least to me. I'm obviously more accustomed to using a mouse. But again, it's about the appropriate use of HTML tags and setting the correct tab order. So when you hit the tab button on your keyboard, you can literally go from item to item on your website so that people can navigate that site with a keyboard. We need to give users enough time to read and use content. A lot of our websites have banner ads that rotate and content that may move in and out or refresh. We need to actually minimize timing of content and give users control of that timing. We need to give them that ability maybe to pause those rotations or, slow down those rotations, things like that, depending on how much time they need to read and understand that content. We need to make sure that content don't cause seizures. So, scrolling text and blinking text and, things that really move fast across our pages is no longer acceptable. It's not that popular anymore. It kind of used to be. I can think of a lot of websites that, had a lot of flashy things going on a few years ago, but that really needs to go away now as a result of these WCAG guidelines. And we need to make sure that we help users navigate and find content. So things like sitemaps need to be accessible from every page of your website. There's actually, part of the code that we add under the perceivable section is for a screen reader to actually be able to skip the navigation menu, but then we still need a way for people to navigate the website from a screen reader, and that's where these sitemaps come into play. Sitemaps are also much easier for people maybe using keyboards to navigate your website sometimes than the navigation menus. So it's one of the important guidelines that's come out. Third area is that we need to make sure that our website is understandable. So again, we need to make text readable and understandable. We want to minimize jargon and acronyms. We want to have an adjustable text size, give people that ability to enlarge the text size or even reduce the text size. We need to make content appear and operate in predictable ways. We want to have consistent navigation between pages and between sections of our website. We don't want to make people kind of have to relearn how to use our website in different areas. And again, that kind of goes towards just good web design in general. We want to help users avoid and correct mistakes. Again, this really comes into play with forms and applications on our web pages, but we want to label form fields. We want to have user-friendly error messages. We want to have nice, friendly confirmations when forms are submitted. All those types of things to, really help any user, whether they have disabilities or not, know that they're using the website, know that we've gotten their information, know that somebody's going to get back to them, all of those types of things. And we need to make sure that our websites are robust. So we need to maximize compatibility with current and future tools. Obviously, technology changes every day, right? We all know that. These assistive technologies for people with disabilities continue to change. One of our programmers here happens to be deaf and has a cochlear implant device. And he goes down to, to get literally software upgrades on his hearing device on, I believe it's a quarterly basis. And every quarter he can actually hear a little bit better. Well, the same type of thing is happening with these screen reader technologies and, different assistive technologies for people with disabilities on these websites. And the only way that we can make sure that our websites keep up is to make sure that they're coded properly, with standard HTML, and they're really up to speed, on the programming side, so that they're compatible with those future tools that are coming out that we don't even know anything about. So how do we make sure that our websites can get there, right? What do we need to do to get our websites to meet these guidelines? How do we evaluate where our site is and what we need to even fix? So it comes down to the fact that you need a tool to scan your website. Most of these web content accessibility guidelines, you can't just eyeball a website and say, yep, that one's, that one meets all of the guidelines and that one doesn't. You really have to be able to look at the back end coding and all sorts of things. And, that takes a tremendous amount of time, but there's a lot of really good tools out there to scan a web page and tell you right off the bat, whether or not all of the items meet these accessibility guidelines and maybe what needs to be looked at. But it's not quite that easy either, because many of these guidelines need to be verified manually. And what I mean by that is we can use a computer to scan scan a web page, scan a website, and it can tell us, when it finds a picture or a logo, right, or an image, it can tell us if that one of those alt tag descriptions is in place. So it can say, yep, there's a text description for that image. But a computer can't tell us if that text description actually adequately describes the image. So it's still going to, make a human look at that description and say, yes, that is a logo, for XYZ Credit Union. So that description, XYZ Credit Union, is appropriate for that image. Or that's a picture of a car, so, that's the appropriate description for that image. So what you'll see, and I'll show you some examples, coming up, but a lot of these things still need to be verified by a human. Some of these tools to scan your website are free. So here are some suggestions to websites that you can go to. You can plug in the web address, of a web page, and it'll come back and give you, the results. It'll show you what on these pages, may need to be verified or what needs to be fixed to bring them into alignment with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So those are some good resources for you to use. Some of the tools are not free. A lot of these are subscription-based, and they provide additional benefits over the free tools. So some of the benefits that they provide, just so you're aware, is that they offer full site scanning. So these tools in particular on the left, they'll scan one page at a time, which is great if you're going to fix that page, but they won't scan the entire site. Where these subscription-based tools, you can put in the web address of the home page, and they'll go through and scan the entire site. The subscription-based tools will also provide a report. So they'll show you everything in the entire site that needs to be corrected. They can also do some automated scanning and even email alerts. So you can set them up to scan the website on a weekly basis or a monthly basis and then send you an email. So after you initially potentially correct the web accessibility issues, you can then set it up so that maybe every week or every month it goes through, scans the website, and if it finds anything that needs to be adjusted after that, it sends you an email. But you also need to be aware that some of these, can get a bit expensive. So, some are affordable, some aren't. There's a ton of them out there. There's more and more really, it's kind of like social media tools. There's more and more coming out every day because it's such a large, a large market right now. There's just so many people that are interested and needing, web accessibility services. So this is an example of a tool that we use at LKCS, just so you're aware of what one of these tools looks like. And what we do is we go through and we scan a website. So in this case, this scan found 13,524 accessibility issues. That shouldn't scare you. That's actually a really low number. We've seen sites with 500,000-600,000 items found. These 13,000 issues were found across 59 web pages. What you have to understand is, again, these aren't all items that need to be addressed. In this case, we've broken this out between the level A guidelines. Remember, these are kind of the more basic set of accessibility guidelines, and the level AA guidelines, which are a little bit more stringent. And what we found in this scan example is 526 errors. Errors are things that we feel absolutely need to be corrected. The scanning engine tells us that these items need to be corrected. Warnings are items that most likely need to be corrected. And items that need review, those are the items that, again, need to be verified by a human. So those would be things like, the image alt tags that we discussed a few minutes ago that you have to look at and say, yeah, while there's an alt tag present, you just have to confirm that description accurately describes that image. So we had a question come in regarding whether this webinar is being recorded, and yes, it is. So you'll be receiving an email this afternoon with a link to our YouTube channel, and you'll be able to view the recording. And the attachment in the GoToWebinar toolbar actually has a copy of the presentation, and a link to that is also included in the email you'll receive this afternoon. So those needs review items, those are, again, the items that just need to be verified by a human. So a lot of those may not actually need any work done. It's just that they need to be verified. So a lot of times these can go through, we can go through these, a web developer can go through those usually pretty quickly. As we dig in further, again, this is our tool, but a lot of these tools are very, very similar. This is an example to show you all of the accessibility issues found and how many pages potentially they're found on. So this is actually the language of the guideline. Some of this makes sense, some of it doesn't, and I'll explain how we understand what these things are in a minute. But this is looking particularly at the level AA guidelines. And it'll show you that, when we're looking at sufficient contrast between text and background colors, that, it's flagged one page. Sites must have a site map. It's flagged 56 pages. So this is kind of indicating to me maybe that this website doesn't have a site map on any of the pages. So we just got to go through, and maybe it does. Again, this is one of those items that need human verification. So this is one of those things where there's probably 56 errors, or items tied to this. If I fix it once, I've literally fixed it 56 times. So that's how you can get these numbers to drop, fairly quickly. But we just have to verify and see, yeah, it really does have a site map. The computer just couldn't tell. So this is an example, again, of, some of how these things get summarized. As we continue to go through, one of these scanning systems, we can get more and more detailed. So this is now we're looking at a specific page, and we're trying to find out exactly where on a page an item is. So when a web developer is looking at this, it'll actually show them exactly where in their code the problem is. So on line 665 of this web page's code, it'll tell them that, this is the problem. And the problem is that alt text for all IMG or image elements is the empty string if the image is decorative. Well, that may not mean anything to me, and probably doesn't, right? I'm not a web developer. So most of these tools, at least these paid tools, and even those free ones that I gave you, typically will have a link like this. Ours says Open Accessibility Help Center, and that will provide a great bit of detail into these errors. So to give you an example, this actually explains, help is available for each and every one of these guidelines. So what you'll see again is the language for the specific guideline. This is a different one than the one before, but it'll provide a description in English. So in this case, the anchor element must contain text. The text may occur in the anchor text or in the title attribute. It tells us how to fix it, and it tells us how to check for it, and a procedure, again, of how to verify that. And it even shows us the expected result and the failed result. And it'll show us even code examples of what passes and fails each of the guidelines, each and every one of these. So your web designer, whether they're in-house or, a third party that you use, whoever's responsible for maintaining your website can use one of these tools to identify the issues on your website and then actually use the tool to explain what the issue is and how to fix it. Personally, I think the paid tools do a better job of it, but again, you do have your choice between some of the free options out there and some of these paid ones. But the important thing to know is they all have resources, or at least the better ones, the good ones, have resources to give you the information and to lead your web designer right to the information about what these guidelines mean in plain English, not in government lawyer speak, but in plain English, and give them examples and instructions that they can understand as a web designer on how to fix them in each and every one of these items. To actually fix these things, I mean, your web designer, if they haven't already been doing a lot of this web accessibility work, they're going to have to do some research, because quite frankly, it takes much longer to understand many of the requirements than it does to actually fix them. Most of the items in the web content accessibility guidelines are small and relatively easy to fix, but there are tons of them. I mean, again, that example scan that I showed you a few minutes ago, there were 13,000 or something items listed, and I told you that some of the real scans that we run for clients, it's not unusual to have a few 100,000 items. So those are things that all have to be corrected or at least verified. So you can imagine, that there's time, right, involved, even in the verification and then obviously in the fixing. There are some larger issues, that can take some significant time to fix, but most of the items are really little. And a lot of the times, like I showed you with the sitemap, for example, if you fix it once, you fix it across every web page. So those numbers can drop fairly quickly, but it still takes time. And, should you even fix your site, right? And it's not as easy to answer that question as you may think. There's a lot of things you need to consider before you go ahead and just start fixing the accessibility issues on your site. Just so you know, from our experience, the typical financial institution website takes at least 30 to 50 hours to fix. Okay. And that's just on average. So money talks. Is your site due for redesign? If it's old or outdated, it may be worth taking the cost of 30 to 50 web development hours and putting it towards that redesign. Is your current site responsive? Meaning, is it mobile friendly? Again, if it's not, it might be time to redesign it and, reinvest that money that it was going to take you to fix it and make it web accessible, but also make it responsive, with a new design. And are you able to manage and update your site as easily as you need? I mean, these are all things for you to consider, because obviously web design has changed a lot in the past few years. And, any web designer that knows, that works with banks and credit unions should know about web accessibility now, and any new website they're designing should be accessible right out of the box. And should also be responsive right out of the box. And obviously, it should be able to, should be easy for you to manage and update. So all of these things are things you might want to consider as you consider spending the money to actually have your site corrected. And obviously, do you have the expertise in-house, or do you need to hire it out? And we'll talk about that here for a few minutes as well. To maintain web accessibility going forward, though, is really important, because web accessibility is not just a one-and-done kind of project. Many of your websites probably are built with content management systems, and you guys are used to updating and editing content of your websites, every day on the fly. And websites are often updated by people who are currently not aware of any accessibility requirements. So, you can go ahead and go through all the pains of making your site fully accessible, and then, somebody else can start uploading photos and videos and all sorts of other things to your website that they're not adding alt tags, and they're not adding captions, and they're just adding content that doesn't meet the accessibility guidelines, and now all of a sudden your site doesn't meet those requirements again. So you need a way to, continuously monitor that website and audit it on a regular basis. So again, this is where some of those subscription-based tools, those paid tools, make sense, because you can have, either have the tool automatically, scan that site for accessibility issues, or have a third-party firm, be responsible for giving you a report, or somebody internal run a report, something like that for you on a monthly or quarterly or even a semi-annual basis, so if there's anything that needs to be updated. And the fact of the matter is that we fully expect these web content accessibility guideline standards to change. We talked about it earlier. The Department of Justice hasn't adopted a set of standards. While they're currently at version 2.0, they may very well be at version 3.0 by the time the DOJ adopts them. And when they change, any of these tools that we're using, to audit websites are obviously going to be updated as well. But you're going to need to be aware of, anything that may now need to be updated because those WCAG guidelines change. And obviously we don't know when those guidelines may change, but just the fact that they're at version 2 means there used to be a version 1. So if there used to be a version 1, there's probably going to eventually be a version 3. So when you talk about web accessibility, whether you do it in-house or you outsource it, you really have kind of 3 options, right? And you can subscribe to accessibility reporting only, or find a source for reports only. Not really my recommendation, to be quite frankly, but when we talk about reporting only, reports will measure how well your site meets the WCAG accessibility guidelines. Reports will show you how many pages have potential accessibility issues and what those issues are. But in my experience, reports by themselves do not provide all of the information that you or your web developer would actually need to fix the accessibility issues. They're solely designed to give you a baseline of where your site stands in relation to the guidelines. So remember kind of when I showed you how you can get an explanation of what each guideline means and see instructions on how to actually fix, each item and code examples of what meets or fails. You don't get that with a report. So, you can certainly get reports and get reports only, and, that meets your requirement, I guess, for, having some oversight, and seeing where the site is, but it doesn't really help you address any accessibility issues. A better option, I think, is for you to subscribe again to an online tool or a dashboard that provides web access to a web governance solution, whether it's ours or somebody else's. Web governance or web accessibility, kind of the same thing. These online tools will identify, again, exactly which pages are affected, what elements on the pages are problematic. They'll allow you to review the specific guideline for each item, explain those guidelines, and show you, hopefully, the better ones, example of code that actually meets the guidelines and code that doesn't. These systems are designed for web developers to go through and make changes to the site as they review the requirements. So they're perfect if you have in-house expertise or if you have third-party designers that need additional support, to correct the accessibility issues. So, if you have somebody in-house that maintains your websites for you, that has a little bit of HTML knowledge, or if you've got, that trusted web development firm that you really like working with, but they don't know too much about web accessibility, they can go out, and if they don't already have, a tool or a dashboard, you can go out and subscribe to one, give them access to it, and they'll have the information they need to correct the website. And obviously we can provide our dashboard to you and to your third-party designers if you need it. And your third option is to outsource the work. So with a full service type approach, you can select a vendor that does all of this work for you. They would scan your website. They would make any changes needed to meet the web content guidelines, accessibility guidelines. They would hopefully provide a report of web accessibility before and after changes were made, so they could show you, before the website you had 13,000 and some odd issues, and after we were done you had 0. And they should be able to continue to monitor and correct the site on an ongoing basis. So those are kind of your three options, on how you can approach this problem. And obviously, we feel that vendor should be us. So here's my sales pitch. But LKCS has that ability to identify, resolve, and monitor your site for compliance. We offer all of those three levels of service, so we can provide just the reports. We can provide that online access to you, so show you how to use our dashboard and access our dashboard, or we can correct everything for you. And each level of service is available from us on a one-time basis. So if you just want to fix the issues on your site and leave it at that, that's cool. But if you also want to, come back on a biannual basis or a quarterly basis or a monthly basis and have us provide an updated report or give you online access, for the next year, or provide full service, where we come back, every quarter or every month, or whatever frequency you want us to come back and make any changes that are needed. Those are all things that we can work with you and, get your pricing to do all of that. So that's all I have. I am definitely available to answer any questions. So feel free to type them into your GoToWebinar toolbar, and obviously feel free to contact me offline as well. I'd be happy to get you any information I can about web accessibility in general, and certainly about any of our web services. So thank you very, very much for your time today. I hope I provided some information that was helpful.